This year is a unique year in oh so many ways. But one of the lesser ways it's a unique year is that you guys get the second Sunday John reading. Why? Because in the case in which Christmas falls on a Saturday, that means that Epiphany falls so close to baptism of our Lord, but not close enough to the second Sunday that you can't move it back and therefore read the wonderful Epiphany story. And therefore you get the birth narrative from John. Yay! It's a once every 7 years sort of thing, so don't worry. Got 7 more years before this happens again. Okay? But I think it's a good time to take a moment and take a breath and step back for a second, because I'll tell you, I myself, and I find this true of everyone who reads the Bible, we have our favorite books and our lesser favorite books. John, down there for me. Why? Because I love John, but of course, does he tell us a beautiful story about a baby being born and God coming into the world with all the complicated, crazy things going on? No. Does he tell us about wise men and angels and shepherds? No. What does he spend his time doing? Highlighting a theological treatise that's highly precise to make sure that we understand that God has existed since before John. Thanks, John. It's a reason you never read John on Christmas Eve. But it actually does highlight, and it actually does sort of start to answer an important question that I actually do get around this year every so often. Because in the land of New Year's, you have these things called resolutions. Some of you may have made New Year's resolutions, right? Okay. And one of those that people make from time to time is, you know what? I'm going to read a book of the Bible. I know it's not as popular as like going to the gym, but if that fails for you, try reading a book of the Bible. And so people will come to their pastor and say, hey, pastor, what book should I read? And I'll say, well, have you ever read a whole book? And most people go, well, no. I'll go, okay, that's no problem. But if you've never read a book of the Bible, read one of the Gospels, right? It sort of gives you the climax of the story, covers the main issues, regardless of which one of the 4 you pick. Go with that. And then inevitably people look at me and go, well, which one? My response to them is, well, it depends on how you're wired. And a lot of times people give me a strange look and go, why? Well, the reason it depends is because each one of the Gospels sort of has its own approach, its own way, its own spirituality. And it depends on yours. Mine is not the spirituality of John. Therefore, for me, I'm like, yeah, I'll read John penitentially during Lent. There we go. A few of you got the joke. But it doesn't matter which one you read. Just say you read the one that matches you. And so people say, well, what are the differences? I say, well, let's start off. You have Matthew. Now, Matthew, he's a guy who he really, really, really cares to make sure that you get a moral lesson in every story. How many of you remember watching shows from the 80s through the 90s in which you would have a very special episode? Okay? And you knew in a very special episode that your normal 25 minutes of television would be reduced to 20. You would take on an issue, usually really clumsily, and then at the end, you'd have 5 minutes where all the actors would get up there and they'd say, today we took on the issue, as if you didn't know, of fill in the blank. If you need help, call these numbers. Right? You follow? So that is Matthew. Okay? Matthew's going to give you a story and then make sure in case you didn't catch the moral lesson, he will tell you the moral lesson of the day. So if you're someone who what your interest is to understand what the Bible is trying to say about ethics or morality, go to Matthew. Okay? That's some of us. Others of us are like, ugh, an entire book of very special episodes? No. And that's okay. Now, you have Mark, right? Mark comes next. Matthew, Mark. And Mark is sort of one of these guys. You guys remember Joe Friday from Dragnet back in the day? Okay, I know that's an old reference. Those of you who have never seen Dragnet, go watch it. The old episodes are awesome, okay? I'm sure they're on YouTube somewhere by now. Okay? And Joe Friday would always say, give me the facts and nothing but the facts. right? That's because he didn't care about your elaboration. He just wanted to know what happened, when, what, where. Didn't really care about why, okay? That's Mark. Mark is the shortest because of that. So those of you who like brevity, Mark, okay? And that's what he does. He just tells you the story and then literally says, and then immediately, and then tells you the next story, and then says, and then immediately, and tells you the next story. And he will keep saying that all the way through till the end. And he only puts in there what he thinks is important and not one bit more. Then you have Luke, Matthew, Mark, Luke. And Luke is the storyteller. Luke is the verbose one. I love Luke. I know it tells you something about me, right? And I really love Luke because Luke dives into the story, tells you about all the human dynamics, digs into things, tells you it not just in the sense of this is this story, but tells you how it connects to the next one, tells you how it connects to the last one, tells you how that connects to Acts, tells you how that connects all the way back to Isaiah, sort of connects the entire Bible together in this one giant, beautiful, sort of artistic, but human realism that I love. You can tell which one I like reading, right? And so those of you who like to delve deeply into a story but don't want a very special episode, go with Luke. But understand, you get a good story, and you get a good storyteller, you also get verbosity. Okay? And then last but not least, you have John. John is the philosopher. John is the theologian. John is your college professor. Okay? And so John's interest is not to tell you the story. He sees a story and he looks right through it and wants to go for the essential truths and natures behind the human experience. And the human experience is, secondary because he's got the truths. We've all met that college professor, right? Okay? The Indigo Girls sung of that college professor. 2 people on the internet just cheered for me. Okay? And what John does is that's how he arranges the entire thing. And from those moments of beautiful philosophical and theological findings, you do have, I would say, some of the most poetic and beautiful moments in the Bible. John 3:16, for example. But as a whole, with the exception of these beautiful moments that you'll find throughout John, I sort of sit there like I did in my seminary classes and go, can we talk about people again? Because people's what matters. But here's the thing. I think there's a greater lesson to be learned than just sort of the factual nature about who the gospel writers are and trying to match yourself to which gospel is there. I think that's a good practical lesson. But I think there's a deeper practical message in the fact that there's 4 of them. See, if God or the early church had wanted perfect unity, if God or the early church valued theology as their top thing, or if God or the early church had valued doctrine as their most important thing, there would have been one gospel, right? That would have made things a lot easier, right? Because you wouldn't have all these points where they sort of disagree or sort of rub against each other, or you say, well, Matthew said this, but then John said that, but Luke said this. Which one's right? Were there magi? Because Matthew didn't note them. But Luke did, right? Here's the thing. The lesson from the fact that we have these 4 different gospels, these 4 different perspectives, these 4 different spiritualities, tells us that both God and the early church valued diversity of spirituality above theological conformity, which tells us an important thing about who we are as Christians. That the thing that we should value is that diverse spiritual experience, that diversity of views of the Bible, of experiences of God, long before we valued the conformity of theology. Because had the early church or God been more concerned about theology than spirituality, we wouldn't have had 4 very different gospels from 4 very different perspectives. So as you go out this week, take a few minutes and ask yourself 2 questions in your prayer life. First question, Have you ever read any of the Gospels? And if not, could that be a New Year's resolution you might actually be able to pull off? And 2, are there places where maybe you're valuing the conformity of theology over the diversity of spirituality?